Welcome back. This is week 6, lecture 1, the penultimate lecture for the course. And the theme of this lecture, the title of this lecture is From the Confession of Augsburg to the Peace of Augsburg. What is it then? The End of Christendom. The End of Christendom. Last lecture, we dealt with Calvin and the French situation in Geneva, leading to, let's say, the outcome of the Reformation movements in France with the Edict of Nantes in 1598 and Henry IV. Now we're looking at kind of, let's say, the outcome of the empire. What was going on within the empire? And this is important because the various, let's say, tentacles of the Reformation, or various streams of the Reformation, or manifestations of the Reformation, had different solutions or consequences or outcomes in various political territories. And a major difference from the French and German context was certainly the English context, which I'm not going to be lecturing on, but it is in the textbook and is important, with the ending with the Elizabethan settlement, but then pressing on towards the English Civil War and the Restoration and all these fun developments in England, which are essentially important. So I want you to know those as well. And for the final, should be talking about England as well as France and Germany. It's simply an issue of time and what we can do in terms of lecturing. And in some ways, I know, or at least I think I know, that in empire, the Germanic context and the French context a bit better than I know the English context. I think the textbook is fine. I could add drama to it, I would think and hope, and there's some fun things about it, such as Marsilius of Padua, the political theorist for Louis of Bavaria back in the 14th century, in his Defensor Pacis, really came into its own in the context of the English Reformation with Henry, because Henry's advisors kind of rediscovered Marsilius and used Marsilius as the basis for Henry's proclaiming himself the head of the English Church with the Act of Supremacy in 1534. So that's a fun example, too, of what's going on there. And obviously it's related because with the English context, there's all of the connection with France and Germany as well, especially in terms of the empire. Because when we get to then in England, after Edward VI moves England more towards a Protestant position in England after the Henrician Reformation, we have then the next monarch, Henry's first daughter, Mary Tudor, who's Catholic, and she comes to the throne, and she's actually wedded to, or becomes wedded to, Philip II of Spain, who is Charles V's son, and trying to go back to that English-Spanish alliance that had been there with Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And then Charles V making sure that did not end in divorce or annulment, because of the relationship there and that with the Habsburgs, and all it gets very complicated. And that kind of comes back with Mary Tudor, who then is known as also Bloody Mary, because of her attempts to suppress the Protestants that had already been there. But then she dies, and then Elizabeth takes over in 1559 and reigns until 1603. And Elizabeth, dealing with all the problems that she faced, and it's called the Elizabethan settlement, seemingly was a way forward, and yet there was already a group of Protestants who felt that Elizabeth was undermining the very cause of the gospel. They felt that the Church of England still needed to be purified. They were known as the Puritans, that Puritan faction, that led eventually to the Civil War, and also the Puritans coming to the New World. And they were very much under the influence of Calvin. So that is how that kind of ties in and provides some of the tangential context for what we'll be looking at today, as you'll see when we get there, I hope. But today we're focusing on the empire and what happened in the empire, which was unable to resolve the religious conflict. Last we talked about it, I think I ended with the Confession of Augsburg and the Diet of Augsburg in 1530, where the Melanchthon presented the Confession of Augsburg, and this is really, in some ways, the beginning of confessionalization. Now, I'll be offering a definition and discussion of confessionalization in the final lecture, but it becomes, say, Reformation based on a religious confession. But we'll get to there in more detail. But that inability for either the Protestant side, after 1529, the Protestant cities and princes, becoming known as the Protestants, and then still with no rapprochement at the Diet of Augsburg, we have this division, significant division within the empire. And what to do about it? How is it solved? Because, yes, the Diet and the emperor supposedly had the last say, but yet these Protestant princes and cities were not going along with it. That is military conflict. And even though in early 1530s, Charles still didn't have the leisure, let's say, to devote his forces and his attention to this problem itself, the Protestants realized they were in opposition to the emperor, and civil war was coming about. Now, how this all played out is what the focus of today is. And we will see that it kind of ends, as I have up here, in the end of Christendom as this ideal, as a myth, even as an ideology, at least as denotating major aspect thereof. So with that kind of being the context, we look just first of all, going back to the Confession of Augsburg, and the preparing for war with the Protestant princes, because they realized, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We better prepare ourselves, because now either we go along with the emperor and the Diet, the imperial, Reichstag, imperial legislature. Either we go along with that, or we continue to protest, and that means conflict is coming. And the League of Schmalkalden was established in 1531 as a Protestant defense league. Now, it was not only a Protestant defense league, it was also the military arm of the attempt to spread the Reformation. And as I talk about actually in my book, Luther and the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages, a lot of pressure was put on cities. And I discussed the city of Hildesheim, which was a Catholic city and seeking to effect a Reformation, reform itself along Catholic lines, eventually caved to the League of Schmalkalden and accepted the Confession of Augsburg as the basis for the religious life of the city, even as they had resisted all along. But at a certain point, it just became the pressure, the political pressure, the military pressure became too great, and it became a Protestant city. And that is in some ways, this league, when I say it was not just a defense league, it also was furthering politically, militarily, the Protestant cause and the Protestant doctrine, whereby Reformation from this point on meant accepting the Confession of Augsburg as the basis for church doctrine, church life, organization, religious policy, the basic theological positions, and so. Now, I'll talk more about that process of confessionalization. Again, next lecture, kind of wrapping up the whole course. But here we want to see that this is what is going on in the early 1530s. And it gets to be a very tense situation within the empire. What are we going to do about this? And there had been since 1520, and in 1521, with Luther's excommunication, there had been this resistance of the Germanic, I'm going to just use German for shorthand, but the imperial, the German princes, that we should handle this issue on German soil. This should not be an issue that we bring in Rome for. And yet they still were calling for a general council to solve the issue. The attempt to reform the church of the various movements reform movements and the impetus is coming out of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and just continuing the need for reformation within the church as such, within still the Catholic Church, the universal church. We're calling for a universal council, general church councils to deal with these issues. There had been the Fifth Lateran Council, as I had mentioned, in 1512, but that was before things kind of got out of hand, so to speak, with Luther. That was just on the kind of the precipice of when Luther was going to become a major issue. And there was resistance within the hierarchy to call a council, as there had been resistance to calling a council for the Fifth Lateran in 1512, going all the way back to Pope Pius II's condemnation of conciliarism in Execrabilis in 1460, talking about that whole conciliar approach. The conciliarism was seen by the papacy as a threat to its own power and authority and position. So there was a lot of resistance. And yet, still, finally, they thought we need to get our house in order. And yeah, a council is the only way. And that leads me then, in general context, to go back and talk about the Catholic and Counter-Reformation. Now, the Catholic and Counter-Reformation are two terms that are used that are descriptive, and it's problematic to see what was going on within those territories that remained loyal to the emperor and loyal to the pope, as well as Catholic territories such as France, even though France had been operating somewhat independently of the papacy since the Pragmatic Sanction of Bruges in 1438, when the papacy granted the King of France a lot of independence in terms of handling church affairs. Spain still was very loyal to the papacy. So there's this issue of what do we do about this problem? I mean, the Pope had condemned Luther, called for his excommunication, called for the gathering of all his works and banning his works and burning his works if they could be confiscated, and for Luther to be sent to Rome to be tried for heresy. So the issue is, beyond that, do we still somehow put our own house in order, so to speak? The humanist reform movement, in terms of the humanists who argued for reform, such as Erasmus of Rotterdam, who just could not go so far as Luther did, was still very prevalent within the Catholic faction. And I already talked about last week's lecture with France, in terms of the humanist reform circles in France. That's part of this humanist reform effort to let's make sure we kind of clean things up and get our act together. But it was even beyond that. And so the scholarship has struggled over the years with terminology. And again, so much the terms that are used to describe historical developments are ideologically loaded. And with the Reformation, certainly theologically loaded. And at first it was often called the Counter-Reformation, meaning what then steps did the institutional church, papal church, take to counter Protestants. And there were a number of those. Then thereafter, later scholars came along and said, also Catholic scholars said, yeah, but it wasn't just this counter movement. There had been an attempt at Catholic Reformation all along, and that brought up Catholic Reformation. Other scholars came along more recently and said, yeah, what we should just call it is early modern Catholicism, because it was both elements of both of Catholic Reformation and Counter-Reformation, and neither really capture the entire description of the developments. So that may be as it be. And I think in some ways early modern Catholicism is a good way to put it. But I do want us to see both the continued ongoing efforts to effect a reformation within the Catholic and the Roman Catholic tradition now, as we can begin to call it, the Roman Catholic tradition, loyalty to Rome, as well as then part of that being efforts to counter explicitly Protestantism as it was developing and growing and spreading. So that is what I'm going to look at here. Now, this early modern Catholicism, or the Catholic Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, was based still on what I called religionization. Now, again, these terms, the term religionization is my term that I've coined to describe the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, which is kind of my term as well. Whereas confessionalization has been out there in the scholarship for since the 80s. A couple of German scholars, Heinz Schilling being one, put forward this thesis of confessionalization, which I'll talk more about again next lecture. But what we find is that there was this continuation of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages based on religionization, how to make individuals religious and to live a religious life, that personal individual attempt to change, because that was seen both as the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and continuing on as the basis for all Reformation. At the Fifth Lateran Council, the Giles of Viterbo, the general of the Augustinian order, gave one of the opening addresses and said, humans must not, the holy is not to be changed by humans, but humans are to be changed by the holy. That, in some ways, summed up the religionization, in some ways, allowing or making possible the change within human beings based on the holy, to allow the holy, however defined, to change human beings, rather than having human beings decide this is holy, this is not, and this is how we have to change the holy in order to make it fit with what we think or believe or want or whatever. This became the basis for these attempts to effect a reformation in the church loyal to Rome. And we see this with spiritual groups. There were a number in Italy who were calling for reformation. Even the Pope Paul III was a reforming pope and was open to these movements in the 30s. And he said, yeah, we do need to get a council together. But then, gosh, what do we do now about it? He never could really pull it off. And when he dies, there was a contested election between one of the cardinals, Cardinal Pole, who was English, who was part of that reforming or Reformation party within the Catholic fold. He came only one vote short from being elected Pope. And what ended up happening is the more hardline traditional candidate was elected and became Pope Paul IV. And as Pope Paul IV came into office, he was not nearly as open to movements of Reformation, to changes, even though he realized that a council was needed. And so he eventually called the Council of Trent, that met for the first time in 1545. But I'll be getting to there when I get there. But this other aspect of how do we counter the Protestants, and I have a particular slide on this, is slide number 4, that issues a number of strategies and means to counter Protestantism as it was growing on. Now, I've already talked about in a previous lecture the Catholic propaganda attempt, that they were behind the Protestants, but with the use of images and popular pamphlets being spread around to get the message out, there was certainly this an appeal to the populace to try to shape popular opinion and public opinion to keep it in harmony with the Catholic tradition. Now, here again, I'm struggling with terminology here, because technically, still, even in the 1530s, the term Catholic simply meant universal. And so the Protestants would still say, of course we're Catholic. Of course we're Catholic. We are to be the universal truth. It is during this period of the 1530s, 1540s, and 1550s that we can really historically start talking about Roman Catholicism, meaning what had been the traditional church, who continued adherence to the papacy and the papal church, in some ways like the papal church. It almost then becomes its own denomination. That is not necessarily a fortunate term, but it's what we are kind of stuck with. And what had been, let's say, the Catholic Church, which was simply Christianity and always had been from the very beginning, becomes, in the course of the 16th century, splintered into various denominations, of which Roman Catholicism became one, and Lutheranism became one, and Calvinism became one, and on we go, and Anglicanism and so forth. So this is kind of this development. That's why I struggle, because I don't want to say Catholic, because that could mean also everyone. And I don't want to say Roman Catholic, because in the 1530s, even still, it's not technically yet Roman Catholicism. There's still this idea that we can fix this somehow, put this together. There are tensions, there's divisions, there is our failed attempts, such as the Deed of Augsburg in 1530, to bring about a solution to that hope and ideal of we are still Christendom, one in a whole, and we will work this out. We're still there, even if it was very tenuous and sometimes simply lip service as we go forward. So that's why it gets to be kind of problematic in terms of terminology. But in terms of this attempt to counter the Protestants, and the Protestants, again, since 1529, were those German cities and princes who protested the decision of the Diet of Speyer in 1529 to enforce the Edict of Worms, which was the edict condemning Luther. And they protested that, and they did again at the Diet of Augsburg, and that is the source and origins of Protestantism, protesting the political as well as religious and theological decisions of the imperial legislature. So here we have the issue of what to do about it if we are loyal to Rome. How do we counter this? And that propaganda was one means, and the early means. But then it began to be clear that this is a broader issue than simply sending out pamphlets and cartoons portraying Luther as this drunken sod who runs off with a nun. We have to be more serious about this, and also because this is spreading and this is dangerous. And keep in mind, from that Roman perspective, at least let's say the sincere, forget the politics and all those things, but the sincere Roman perspective, this was an issue of salvation. And Protestantism was threatening the eternal salvation of the souls of Christendom. This is dangerous. Now, on the other side, certainly by the 1530s, Luther is feeling thoroughly this way, and Calvin was feeling this way. The Roman position undermined and threatened the salvation of the souls of Christendom. So they're both coming from the same perspective, but what to do about it in some ways. But for the Catholic side, or increasingly the Roman Catholic perspective, then we have to condemn, and not only condemn, but we have to counter these heretical Protestant efforts to threaten and undermine the salvation of Christendom. Salvation was indeed at stake. So it's not just propaganda. And in 1542, they established the Roman Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition, it's a problem historiographically. There were inquisitions previous to the Roman Inquisition, but here we're talking about an institution. Earlier on, before 1542, and actually I should say between 1478 with the Spanish Inquisition, because this too is an institution. That's the first institutionalized Inquisition, is the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, excuse me, where there is not simply inquisitors, but here is an institutionalized body that is given the task of seeking out and finding. That's what Inquisition is. It's a case study. It's an asking. It's a seeking of what was going on. So it is only in 1542 that there's the Roman Inquisition. My guy, Jordan Quedlinburg, was appointed as an inquisitor to handle a specific case. So there was no such thing as the medieval Inquisition. There were medieval inquisitions, meaning investigations and trials, cases that had to be settled, where individual inquisitors were appointed, but there was no centralized institution. There became one in 1542 with the Roman Inquisition, and there had been already there in the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, and then in Spain, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 is a work of the Inquisition, which then really got going, because once you expel all the Jews, the Jews were given the choice of either converting to Catholicism or Christianity. At the time, this was Christianity, or leaving Spain. A lot of Jews left Spain. Some said, "Oh, we convert," but it's like, did they really convert? And that was where the Inquisition came along, primarily. Other heretics as well, but primarily that was the context of it, to ensure that Jews who were expelled were not simply feigning conversion. That would also apply to other heretics. The Roman Inquisition in 1542 was established to counter Protestantism in general. And inquisitions would be brought up. And we have Inquisition records. We have, in the archives in the Vatican, you can go into the Inquisition. It was headed by the Master of the Sacred Palace. Now, the Master of the Sacred Palace had been there. It was an office that had been there long. It was the Pope's primary theologian. And that office had been there for quite a long time. Often the Master of the Sacred Palace would give speeches before the Pope, preaching for the Pope, and was responsible for anyone else who would be preaching before the Pope, also kind of as a showpiece. And there's been a great book by John O'Malley on that, sermons before the Pope. And the Master of the Sacred Palace was in charge of that. And so the Master of the Sacred Palace actually became the Inquisitor, because that was kind of the role of that position that then just was bumped up to being in charge of the Inquisition. Now, that being said, that was only one institution, was the institution of the Roman Inquisition. Another was also an institution, the Index of Prohibited Books. The Roman Index was established in 1559, and that too became an institutionalized setting as part of the Inquisition. Within the hierarchy is an institutional setting, and so you can go to the Roman Index. There had been indexes before. What's an index? It's just a listing of books to be banned, or the books that needed correction in order to be acceptable. I don't know if any of you have seen a book published on a religious topic from the let's say mid-1960s and previous, and you open it up, and then there's a couple of statements in Latin. Nihil obstat is one, is nothing that is objectionable. That's all based on the index, whereby it is controlling what can be published for a good Catholic book, what's acceptable. And there had been indexes for a while. Paris establishes the index in 1544, and then Louvain in 1446, and they keep revising their list of books that were banned or needed correction. And then they have censors and expurgation, the Roman Index in 59, 64. So these are all various lists. I mean, Erasmus got on the list. And actually, a good friend of mine, I don't think I've mentioned this before yet, but maybe I have, I don't think so. A good friend of mine who's actually at the University of Missouri. A long story, but he was one of the very first people who was granted access to the records of the Inquisition and the Index in the Vatican, working together when he was at Tübingen with Peter Godwin, professor of Latin there. And John came across, because he was working on some of these things, and he Godwin let him said, "Go ahead and do your own research." But John came across records from the Index, and these were censors. These were censors who are saying what needs to be expurgated, what needs to be cleaned up or changed, and what is acceptable to get that nihil obstat. There's a book I've worked with Antonius Rampogolis and Augustinian. I think I may have mentioned him in terms of talking about the origins of the observance. It's Fagoria Bibliorum, but it was published repeatedly in the 16th century and on into the 17th century. And there it too went under the expurgation. It There was a list that started being printed at the front of it, which just said these changes must be made. And what's so interesting is that it didn't change the printing; it just added a sheet of corrections. You kind of have to, read into it if you wanted to see the correct version. So it still allowed the book to be published as it was. It just said, but here is a sheet, an insert of corrections that you should make so you get it right, so to speak. Other censorships were more intrusive, more complete, and then there were some certainly that were outright banned. Like Luther was outright banned. It was illegal in terms of Roman Catholicism at this time for a Roman Catholic publisher to publish the works of Luther. Erasmus was on that list too. So it gets to be this sense of if we can control what the information being put out there is, we can shape public opinion, and that would be a good thing. Let's make sure that we don't get unacceptable literature into the hands of elementary school kids if we're in Florida. That's the same kind of idea, this banning of books and literature. And that was what was going on as a means to counter the Protestants. And then two other means for countering the Protestants. One that would have major impact. One was the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. And the Jesuits were formed by Ignatius of Loyola, who was a Spanish soldier, actually, and ended up being injured. And while he was in hospital recovering, he read rather intensively the Lives of the Saints, the Legenda Aurea was it called, and Ludolf of Saxony's Life of Christ. And had a conversion experience. And he founded a new order called the Society of Jesus, known today mostly by the shortened version of the Jesuits. Now, there's a lot I could say about the Jesuits. They were a learned order, and essentially you almost had to have a doctorate to become a Jesuit, still even today, to be a full Jesuit. It's a long, arduous process. And they had the mission of education. It's like, how do we counter the Protestants? If we educate the populace. If we do so correctly, they will know. And still today, Jesuit education is the major, let's say, public face of the Jesuits, at least in this country today. Very academic, very learned, very scholarly, very good, even if you disagree with them. But yet, Ignatius then also said we need to deal with the religious life. And he had written a work for himself that he shared with his earliest brothers called the Spiritual Exercises. The Spiritual Exercises was a month-long retreat, so to speak, to examine your own soul. It gave devotional practices, meditative practices, teaching you how to think about things, and also then gave a series of rules in terms of how do we go about thinking correctly. What are the rules that we follow, not only in terms of our actions, but also in terms of what we think and how we think. And it is in there, in terms of one of the rules of thinking with the church, that Ignatius makes this statement: I will believe that the black object I see is white if I am so instructed by the authority of the Holy See. Meaning, if the Pope tells me what I clearly with my eyes see as being black, if the Pope says, no, that is white, I follow the Pope. Obedience was part of all the monastic vows, the basic monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And with Luther's vows, Luther vowed obedience, but not to the Pope. As I think I talked about, Luther's vows included vowing obedience to God, to the Virgin Mary, and to the Prior General of the order, the Augustinian order. Loyola, in his spiritual exercises, and also in his establishing of the Jesuits, included a special fourth vow, obedience to the Pope. It's almost ironic, perhaps, that you think of today, if you know anything about the history of the Jesuits thereafter, on into the 17th century and further. Since they were intellectuals and were very highly educated, this became a stumbling problem block for them in some ways. And today, some of the most problematic theologians for the papacy have been Jesuits. Um, and so it's like, okay, how do we, deal with these people? Because they're not necessarily just accepting Loyola's rule from the spiritual exercises at face value. And in any case, of accepting as white what they see to be black. So it's that kind of an approach, and the Jesuits actually were kicked out of France a couple of times because they were undermining the religious authority and things. But that's into all kinds of other issues that we can't deal with here. But they were, let's say, the counter troops of the Catholics. The Counter-Reformation to attack the Protestants. And they were very effectively setting up a whole network of schools and spreading this whole approach of, let's say, a militant Roman Catholicism, both in education and in approach from that point on. And then the last means of countering the Protestants was finally to call a church council to once and for all determine more comprehensively than had been done previously. How do we handle this problem, and what is the true Roman Catholic position? Of course, they're calling it simply the Catholic position. And that became the Council of Trent, which met for the first time in 1545, and then had like 3 sessions, ending in 1563. Now, the Council of Trent set the doctrine for Roman Catholicism from 1545 to 1563 until the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. That impact that the Council of Trent had was huge. And that began with the Council of Trent in the 16th century as a way, number one, of both setting our own house in order, kind of combining these two strains of Catholic Reformation and Counter-Reformation into one final solution of a series of decrees to say this is the official Roman Catholic position. Again, or Catholic position, and if you don't adhere to it, you're a heretic. I'm not going to go into all the different decrees and all the debates that were going on and the different factions of the political strategizing, but I do want to discuss with you and show you the Council of Trent's decree on justification. So if we go from, this is slide 4 with the countering the Protestants, and then I have slide 5 going back to the Catholic and Counter-Reformation coming together, and then slide 6 here and slide 7, because it continues on into slide 7, is a decree on justification, which was one of the first decrees that the council established. And I want you to read it. I'm not going to read all of it to you, but I'm going to point out some particular lines. And this is not the entire decree, but it's a kind of a cut and paste section, an important section from it. If we look at that, and that's why I have it up here in the slides, I may end up reading most of it to you. It states out the causes of this justification are the final cause is indeed the glory of God and of Christ and life eternal. The efficient cause is truly a merciful God who gratuitously washes and sanctifies, blah, 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 blah. And finally, the unique formal cause is the justice of God, not that by which he himself is just, but by which he makes us just. That, namely, by which, when we are endowed with it by him, we are renewed in the spirit of our mind, and are not only are we reputed, but we are truly called and are just, receiving justice within us, each one according to his own measure. Now, at least that first part, not our own justice, but that by which God makes us just, is almost word for word from Luther. This is simply passive righteousness. The same passive righteousness that had been advocated in the late medieval Augustinian tradition, that had kind of lost out as we go into the 15th century and later with this attempt to address the anxiety of the period, going back to the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, by developing further than it ever had been before this idea that God will not deny his grace to those who do what is in them, which is not what the Augustinian position necessarily was. Now, Luther did not, as I argued, was not taught the Augustinian position, didn't really know it, even though he was studying Augustine, and got it kind of from there too. But it was part of it. It was a traditional part of Catholic theology in the later Middle Ages. And here it is again in Trent to assert, almost saying by the wayside, look, Luther has nothing new on us because this is our position and has been. Now, yes, it does represent a shift from what had been taught and supported as good Catholic teaching on justification in the later 15th century and on into the early 16th century, and which came in conflict with Luther. And it's that kind of conflict that led, almost forced the Catholics to say, well, wait a minute, yeah, no, actually, he does kind of have a point. And his position is just good Catholic theology and has been. And that is what I want you to see here, that this decree on justification of the Council of Trent, the, let's say, final Roman Catholic position, is based on passive righteousness, the same as Luther's. But there's a distinction and a difference. If you remember, one of the things I said, I believe, Luther's development, what was new with Luther justification, not so much when he first discovered passive righteousness. This was it took him a while to develop this. It was the concept of extrinsic righteousness, that our righteousness is extra nos in Latin, that is outside of us. It's not us. We don't become righteous. We don't become holy. We don't become just. We don't become sanctified. All of that for Luther is Christ. It's like here we are, and Christ stands between us and God the Father. And so what God the Father sees as he's judging us is not us. He sees Christ. But Christ is not us. Christ is here. I don't know if you can see that. I don't know if that makes any sense up there. But that was what Luther was about. He says, our morals are no better than the Catholics. We're just as bad as they are. What makes us different is we accept Christ as our justification. Christ is our righteousness. Now, the position of passive righteousness in the Augustinian tradition of the later Middle Ages and on to here was intrinsic righteousness. Yes, it's passive. God affects it. God brings it about. Yes, it is Christ, without a question. But it's what Christ works in us. That's where we see in the decree of justification at Trent. He says, not only are we reputed, which is extrinsic, but we are truly called and are just, receiving justice within us, each one according to his own measure, which the Holy Spirit distributes to everyone as he wills. And here we go to the next slide, the continuation of it. But when the apostle says that man is justified by faith and freely, these words must be understood in the sense in which the uninterrupted consent of the Catholic Church is held and expressed, namely, that we are therefore said to be justified by faith, because faith is the beginning of human salvation, the foundation and root of all justification, without which it is impossible to please God, and to come to the fellowship of his sons, and are therefore said to be justified gratuitously, because none of those things which precede justification, whether faith or works or merit or grace itself, is justification. For if grace is not is a grace, it is not now by reason of works. Otherwise, as the same apostle says, grace is no more grace. Here we see the Catholic position at Trent of not only passive righteousness, but also justification sola gratia. It is only by grace. But then it's like, what does that work in us? That's where I said there was a relationship between justification and sanctification. And what happened in the later Middle Ages, in the 15th century, the theology that Luther was taught, it kind of inverted it and said that first we need to be sanctified in order to be justified. Whereas the Augustinian position was we are justified so that we can be sanctified. But that sanctification process was really that working in us, that we really become just, that we really become holy. Luther's position is justification has nothing to do with sanctification. Sanctification is living a Christian life as we are, told we are supposed to, and that is important. We must do that. Luther said, I will be should become known as the doctor of good works, doctor, bonorum opero, because that is what I'm actually trying to do. Because good works can only be good if we are not really doing them, thinking that they'll do something for us. So we have to divorce justification from sanctification, and sanctification has nothing to do with justification. Whereas in the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, based on the Augustinian position, justification allows for sanctification. And the Council of Trent doctrine coming back again to the position that yes, justification, passive righteousness, based on grace alone, based on faith, is what enables sanctification. And that is the difference from Luther. Because it's then, only then, when we have that dual form of justification leading to sanctification, that we achieve salvation. And that's why with Trent, it's like, indeed, faith without works is dead. Appealing to the Epistle of James, in which Luther said we should get rid of the Epistle of James from this canon of scriptures. It's a straw epistle for those reasons. Now, I just wanted to point that out. So often we don't really grasp these issues that were so important, the distinctions, and we hear and are told, or we whatever these caricatures. The idea that the Catholic position was, salvation by works is absolutely bogus. Is not historically accurate in any way, shape, or form. Trent is setting the Catholic position. Now, that being said, Trent continued to try to define various aspects of Catholic doctrine. As I said, the decrees of the Council of Trent, once they were over and done with, were published, and that means made available and sent around to bishops and archbishops and priests as this is the official position. And it's also at this time, too, that we find the Roman Catholic Catechism finally jumping on board and establishing a catechism to counter Luther's catechisms. There had not been a catechism before. There was now, to teach, much the same as Luther, to teach Catholic doctrine. So with those different factions, that is those different means, I'm not going to just say strategies, but those different opportunities to counter the Protestant incursions and undermining of Catholic Reformation, provided, let's say, the context as this was all going on for the development from the 1530s on. And we need to understand those developments and the political developments within this context of Catholic Counter-Reformation at the same time as Protestantism is spreading and militarizing. And we have this tension going on within the empire between the Catholic faction and the Protestant faction. What's going to happen? What's going to go on? Because this is really where it comes down to it. After 1530, the Confession of Augsburg, the Diet of Augsburg, again rejecting the Protestants. 1531, the League of Schmalkalden. How do we handle this? What do we do? Luther dies in 1546. First generation is dying out, 1546. Calvin is really beginning to entrench himself in Geneva. And Francis I dies in 1547. Henry VIII dies in 1548. The first generation is falling by the wayside. And there is this growing opposition politically, religiously, theologically. What do we do? How do we handle it? And it was a sense of war is inevitable after 1530 and then 1531 with the League of Schmalkalden. Now, this is a period that is known kind of as the Schmalkaldic Wars. The Schmalkaldic Wars, as I have up here, this is slide 9, is maybe a misnomer because this was not a series of wars like the French Wars of Religion that I talked about, this series of civil wars in France. This was a cold war for the most part, even though it was militarized, as the League of Schmalkalden is trying to gain support. Now, the textbook goes into a lot of more detail than I have here, in terms of how this all came about. But what I want to stress to you is that this is this period of tension. And even though the military battles weren't all that numerous, even though they did come to military conflict, this period from 1531 until 1555, when I get there, was a period of Cold War with a few later on outbreaks of hot war when there's actually military conflict. And there we get to the position here of what is the emperor doing. And the emperor, I mean, in some ways, I really feel sorry for Charles V. He's trying, poor guy. He doesn't always have the opportunity to give his attention to the problem of the Protestants or Luther, going all the way back. In the 1530s, he continues to have problems with France. He continues to have problems with the threat of the Turk. He's still king of Spain as well as Holy Roman Emperor, and he's head of the House of Habsburgs in Austria. So he has his plate full. And there is, by the 1530s, religious problems as well in Spain. And so he has a religio-political mess that is almost incomprehensible how any person could really deal with any of it. And in some ways, Charles didn't do a very good job, or at least not a very successful job, even if we can understand why. So I have up here, again, the Nuremberg Standstill, July 1532, which is simply saying, okay, we've gotten to a point where we can't really do much. We acknowledge that there's an opposition. We're going to just kind of stop the fighting while we can and just recognize that we have to deal with this. Kind of the same position that had been there for the past 10 years in the empire. But then with the Wittenberg Concord in 1536 and the expansion of the League begins to feel that it's gaining ground, because the Wittenberg Concord was a concord between the Lutheran position and the Zwinglian position, the Swiss city-states. And so that all of a sudden, they found a way to compromise to bring us all together so we could, again, provide that united front, the united front that they had hoped to present to the emperor in 1530 at the Diet of Augsburg, after the colloquy of Marburg in 1529, that had all fallen apart. 7 years later, in 1536, they had achieved a solution so that they could present a united Protestant military front over against the emperor and the Reichstag. That ended up leading to conflict, and in 1547, 1548, there was conflict. Charles, in April of 1547, achieved victory at the Battle of Milberg. It's like he finally had the opportunity to deal with the Protestants. Damn it. Finally did. He had settled things with France, gotten that taken care of, at least for the time being. He kind of had his own house in order, so it's like, okay, finally, let's go do it. And the emperor did it. I mean, it's also more politically conflict and more intrigue involved in the League after the high point, let's say, the Wittenberg Concord and increasing expansion, had some political issues. I think the textbook talks about that with Philip of Hesse, who had been there from the beginning, with supporting of Luther, who had offered his castle for the colloquy of Marburg, who had been the initiator of the League of Schmalkalden, got himself into problems with the issue of bigamy. And your textbook talks about that, but it is a great issue and a real embarrassment, because Luther Melanchthon supported the bigamy. It was an issue of he wanted to divorce his wife because he was having an affair and he wanted to marry his mistress and to kind of just get rid of my wife. And Luther Melanchthon said, no, you can't, but just, marry your mistress anyway, because number one, adultery is not very good. Mistress isn't any good anymore. It had always been, assumed that monarchs and princes had mistresses all over the place, not a big issue. But here, all of a sudden, it's like, no, we can't allow that. Divorce still isn't really allowed, but annulment is or was. And Luther Melanchthon, rather than granting a dispensation, like the papal position would always have been, said, no, but bigamy, at least there's a scriptural basis for it in terms of the Old Testament patriarchs. I mean, the problem with Henry VIII in England, switching back to the English part of it, it wasn't just his libido that was an issue with all of his wives and Catherine wanting to divorce Catherine of Aragon. He wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon because Catherine of Aragon, in his mind, Henry's, was not producing an heir to the throne. She just produced this daughter. He wanted a male heir. And Henry knew that the lack of an heir to the throne could lead to civil war over succession. And that has actually sort of how his father came into a rule. Henry Tudor, Henry VII, was through wars of succession, the War of the Roses, with the Stuarts and the Tudors and the Lancasters. And Henry wanted to prevent that. And in his mind, it was Catherine's fault, so he wanted to get rid of her. So what he does is asks for the Pope for an annulment, because divorce was not allowed, but annulment was. And an annulment is the official proclamation that this marriage was never an official marriage. It was never a Catholic marriage. It was illegitimate. And Henry said, because Catherine was my dead brother's betrothed, so she is actually my dead brother's widow, that is too close of a relationship, and therefore my marriage to her is illegitimate, so I need an annulment. Now, under normal circumstances, the Pope would have had no problem doing that whatsoever. Fine, yes. The problem was, Henry had already received a dispensation to marry Catherine for that very reason. In other words, when he wanted to marry Catherine, to preserve that Spanish-English connection after his brother Arthur died, the Pope said, fine, no problem, marry her, doesn't matter. Great. So when Henry then comes and argues, yeah, but that wasn't legitimate, the papacy had already ruled that it was. Number one. Number two, when Henry sent his delegation to Rome to ask the Pope for the annulment, Charles V's troops were already in Rome, sacking Rome, because Charles had found out that the Pope was supporting Francis I of France against Charles. It's like, what? Pope, how can you support Francis over me? I'm the Holy Roman Emperor. You are supposed to support me. So the Pope was in hiding in Castel San Angelo. There were imperial troops of Charles V there, and Charles was like, wait a minute, this is my niece. No way in hell am I going to allow that marriage to be annulled, because that would mean that my family would no longer be heirs to the English throne. That then led to finally the Act of Supremacy. And Henry proclaiming himself head of the church based on Marsilius of Padua's Defensor Pacis. That's kind of that whole, where this all fits together. So the issue of an annulment was not a problem for the popes. The issue of divorce was for Luther and Melanchthon. Annulments didn't really make sense, and they felt that divorce was wrong. So when Philip of Hesse came to them with a problem, they're like, well, okay, don't tell anybody about it. This is the way we can handle it. Just, marry her. At least there's scriptural basis for bigamy. Well, that becomes known. Bigamy was outlawed. Bigamy was against imperial law. Bigamy was one of the reasons why the Anabaptist kingdom at Munster was so fiercely suppressed, because they were openly bigamous on the basis of that in the 30s, as I talked about. So this was a major deal. So Philip of Hesse kind of had to be careful, and he kind of withdrew a lot of his support and almost supported Charles, and so the League is being weakened. And Charles then attacks and is successful in defeating. And then when he says, okay, 1548, this is what we're going to do. I'm imposing right now what was known as the interim. This is not the final solution. We'll get to that. But this is the interim solution. And what will be that? Priests in territories that have been Protestant and who have married can remain married. The doctrine of justification we can work out and work on. The Mass must be reinstituted. The sacraments must be reinstituted. And we will go from there to achieve a final solution. Because right now the Council of Trent is meeting. And we need to wait for the Council of Trent before we can come up with a final solution. This interim was hated. Number one, the priests, most often in the Protestant territories, were not really priests anymore. They were Protestant ministers and pastors. And they refused to implement the interim. Melanchthon tried. So, well, how can we work with this? And this is where the issue of adiaphora, or of non-essentials, came in. And this was partly to lead to the break, or the split within Lutheranism of the two factions, the Gnesiolutherans following Philip von Amsdorf, and the Philippists following Philip Melanchthon after Luther's death. Because the Gnesiolutherans felt that Melanchthon and his followers were being so far gone with trying to appease the emperor and the Catholic position. We need to take the hardline course. So there's conflict and divisiveness all over. But no one liked really the interim. Charles has to deal with issues, and he's also having to deal with family issues. He has a son, Philip, and his brother was in Austria, kind of taking care of the imperial territories and lands. And the issue was, okay, I'm getting up in age, Charles. He was born in 1500, so he's looking towards, he's getting up in age. What do we have for succession? My son Philip II will succeed me as King of Spain, and Ferdinand, my brother, I'll say he can go ahead and be emperor. And then who will be emperor after Ferdinand? Will it be his son Maximilian, or will it be Philip II? How do we handle this? So there's family issues there, and who is going to marry Mary of Burgundy? So that was the issue, because Mary Tudor of England. Ferdinand, Habsburgs, felt that his son Maximilian, as the future emperor, should marry Mary Tudor to make that connection with England, whereas Charles and Philip II wanted Philip to marry Mary. Now, Philip went out, but Charles, again, just kind of had too much. And within this context, he said, okay, the Diet of Augsburg coming up, we'll have to see what we can do. Now, here is the map up here. This is slide 10, which just shows around 1547, it goes up to 1546 or so, the divisions. And here we see the pink territories are Protestant territories, the green territories, light green territories, are Catholic territories, and then the arrows are, areas of influence and kind of mixed territory. So you see there's a very strong faction within the empire of Protestants. And then the Catholics are still there, though. Kind of looks like, okay, how do we handle this situation? It almost is as divided as was the map of France with the Huguenots before the Edict of Nantes. But anyway, that's just there so you can see the extent of the divisions. Now, going on then back to slide 12, or moving to slide 12, the Diet of Augsburg. The interim really was a failure. I've already been talking about the factions within Charles's reign, his brother Ferdinand and his son Philip II. And Charles was like, what do we do? I cannot solve this problem. I have not been able to do it, even when I defeated them militarily at Mühlberg. The solution I tried to put into place things were almost too far gone. Once the horse is let out of the barn, you can't put them back in again, so to speak. Now that's not a phrase that Charles was using or saying that Charles was using, but it was that kind of way. He said, "Okay, I quit. I can't do anymore." Ferdinand would become emperor. Philip II would be king of Spain, and Charles abdicated, went to a monastery. Because at the Diet of Augsburg, what was decided for the problem that could not be solved was that where there is, this is the quotation up there, where there is one ruler, there should be only one religion. In Latin, ubi unus dominus, ibi una sit religio. We can't have divided religious confession within a political territory. Now, this would later be formulated as cuius regio, eius religio, whose reign is the religion. But it's that particular formulation is later, but the principle is there at Augsburg, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Peace of Augsburg, which settled the conflict, the military religious conflict between the Protestants and now the Roman Catholics within the empire. Achieved at the Diet of Augsburg in 1555. This solution for Charles is like it's the end. The idea that political rule went together with a single religious policy and confession remained, but it's like the empire's gone. Because for the empire, we're now accepting two confessions. What do we do about it? This was anything but toleration. Toleration would have been fine. This is not toleration. This is accepting of plurality. Two religious confessions within one empire. How can that be? Especially when, if I'm Charles, the Protestants are heretics. I can't deal with this. I go to a monastery and retire. And I failed. Christendom has shattered. Christendom has been split in two. How can you have an emperor with split confessions? You can't. And what we find is the emergence of state churches. So that the Elector of Saxony could be Protestant. And the Protestant church within Saxony was just that, the Protestant church or the Lutheran church in Saxony or in Hesse or wherever it would be. It would be in the context of the individual state. The idea that the empire is this kind of confederation of states, of principalities, of dukedoms, was no more. That's a lack of toleration, because if you're a Protestant prince, you know what way you're going to go. I'm going to be, a Protestant. Of course I am. So my territory is going to be Protestant. But since now Catholicism is at least legal within the empire, what if it is encroaching in my territory? I'm going to make damn sure I don't have Catholics seeking into my territory. Do you allow Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, to continue to be practiced if you're a Protestant prince? Absolutely not. It's almost a further decrease in toleration, an increase in social control and authority. Because if you're a Catholic prince, a Roman Catholic prince, you feel the same way about the Protestants. Am I going to allow heresy to flourish in my territory? No way. So we need to make sure that we know that there's no Protestantism in our territory if I'm Catholic, or there's no Catholicism, superstition, diabolical superstition in my Protestant territory if I'm Protestant. And this will get at the issue of confessionalization, which I'll talk more about next lecture, because it is the basis of the growth of the bureaucratic state to ensure religious conformity. So this idea that the Reformation led to increased toleration and individuality is absolutely false. It led to the opposite. Because if you were just a regular person, if you were an artisan, if you were a baker, and you were Catholic in a Protestant territory, you could not go to worship. You would either have to move or become Protestant, and vice versa. If you were, a Catholic baker in a Protestant territory, or Protestant, you'd have to move or follow what the law of the land was, what the religion of the prince was, what the religion of he who is reigning was. And the instruments, the state bureaucracy increasingly developed to ensure that that was the case, that there were no hidden Catholics in Protestant territories or no hidden Protestants in Catholic territories. This is also, funnily enough, the time when the witch trials are really beginning to take off. The burning of witches. Fear of the diabolical, fear of the nonconformists. This was not the end of toleration, or the beginning of toleration. It was the lack of toleration, but it was the end of Christendom, which is the last slide to this lecture. Now I have their religious pluralism. Religious pluralism just means a plurality of religious confessions or theological confessions. And within Europe as a whole, now, if we go to the later 1550s, on into the 1560s, because the Peace of Augsburg was settled just as civil war in France was about to break out. England is a mess. If we look to the ends of the settlements in the end of the 16th century, we finally have the Edict of Nantes in France. We have, the Peace of Augsburg is still holding, and the empire barely. The Elizabethan settlement is in place in England, but there are certainly tensions and worries there too. And there too, Catholics were persecuted by Elizabeth, even because they went underground and they were hiding, and they held mass in nobles' castles or manor houses in a hidden way with watch people out. And it's a fantastic story. So within what had been Christendom, that only 100 years previous, 1500, was indeed Catholic, whereby everybody within Christendom, within Europe, was Catholic, led by the Pope and the Emperor. By 1600, there's diversity. But it is diversity not in the sense of, isn't it great? It's diversity achieved after military fighting, after battles, after bloodshed, after death, after killing. And the death and the killing were just to continue. Not only do we have in England leading to the Civil War, but we have, before too long, the outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1618. Which in some ways began as just kind of a European-wide religious war. It's also been called the First World War in some ways. So in terms of, did this all bring about peace and tranquility and harmony and tolerance and acceptance? Absolutely not. It brought about fear, intransigence, the lack of toleration, the increase in the bureaucratic state to ensure conformity. That was early modern Europe, and that was what the Reformation brought about. And we will be wrapping this all up in the next lecture. But as we can just see with the Peace of Augsburg, with Charles' failure, he realized not only that Christendom was over, that we were entering a new world, one that he didn't really want to see. But we also can look at it from one perspective that all of the Reformation movements failed. Failure to reform the church. Luther didn't say we want to break off on our own faction and start our own deal. Calvin didn't say that. Henry VIII didn't even really say that. There wasn't this sense of just let us do our things and leave us alone, and you can do your things and that'll be fine. Even the Peace of Augsburg wasn't that. It wasn't saying, oh, what you're doing is fine. It's what's saying, I will not fight you and kill you now. Whereas before I would if I could. You are wrong, you're heretics, but you are responsible. The idea that the whole church could be reformed, that the whole Catholic Church could be reformed, had failed. And what we have is what today we would call denominations. Roman Catholicism, Lutheranism, Anglicanism, Calvinism, Reformed tradition. And underneath all of this, you have the radicals, the Anabaptists, the anti-Trinitarians, the Mennonites, who lacked any kind of political base. The diversity increased. It did not lead to an increase in toleration or acceptance. But we do find Christendom had crumbled. It was been crumbling for a while. But all of a sudden it's clear. A new world is at hand. The old world is gone. That's where we will start the final lecture for this week and for this class. Thanks so much.